Balzac and the Little Chinese Seamstress by Dai C.G. Chapter 20. Part 3. "I'm in trouble," said the little seamstress. It was the morning after my encounter with the randy suitors. We were in the kitchen at her house, wreathed in greeny yellow steam and the aroma of rice cooking in the pan. She was chopping vegetables and I was tending the fire. We could hear the familiar, regular whir of the sewing machine next door where her father was at work. Neither he nor his daughter seemed to be aware of what had happened to me. To my surprise, they took no notice of the bruising on my left ear. I was so busy trying to think of some excuse for discontinuing my daily visits that I didn't pay attention to what she was saying. "I've got a problem," she repeated. "What, with the cripple and his gang?" "No." "With Luo?" I asked, feeling a sneaky ray of hope. "It's not that either," she said morosely. "I feel guilty, but it's too late now." "What are you on about?" "I've been throwing up. Even this morning. It must be morning sickness." My heart sank to see the tears well up in her eyes, trickled quietly down her cheeks and drip all over the leaves of the vegetables and onto her hands with their crimson-tipped fingers. "My father will kill me when he finds out," she moaned, struggling to keep her voice down. She had missed 2 periods. She hadn't mentioned this to Luo, although it was he who was responsible, or to blame. When he left the mountain the previous month, she was not yet worried. I was more aghast at the unexpected show of emotion than at the news she had just confided in me, for it was not like her to break down and cry. Seeing her anguish was more than I could bear, and I would have thrown my arms around her to console her, had not the whir of the sewing machine next door quickly brought me back to my senses. Besides, it was hard to see how she might be consoled. Although I knew virtually nothing about sex at the time, I did know what it meant to miss 2 periods in a row. Her distress was infectious, and soon I too was shedding tears, although I hid them from her. I felt as if it were my child that she was carrying, as if it had been me and not Luo making love to her under the majestic ginkgo tree and in the limpid water of the secret pool. I was deeply moved. She was my soulmate, and I was ready to spend the rest of my life taking care of her, content even to die a bachelor if that would help. Or I would have married her myself had the law permitted it, even if it meant a chaste marriage, so that she could give birth legitimacy to my friend's child. I glanced at her stomach, but it was hidden under the red hand-knitted woolly jumper, and all I could see was her body convulsing with stifling sobs. Once a woman starts crying over missed periods, there's no stopping her, they say. A pang of fear shot through me, and I felt weak at the knees. I forgot to ask the most pressing question, that is, whether she wanted to be a teenage mother. The reason for this omission on my part was simple. There was not the slightest chance of her being allowed to keep the child anyway. There was not a hospital, doctor, or midwife to be found in these parts who could be persuaded to break the law by offering assistance to an unmarried woman in labor. And Luo wouldn't be able to marry the little seamstress for several years, given that marriage under the age of 25 was illegal. The situation was hopeless. There was nowhere for them to go, for there was no conceivable place where a Romeo and his pregnant Juliet might elude the long arm of the law, nor indeed where they might live the life of Robinson Crusoe, attended by a secret agent turned Man Friday. Every nook and cranny of the land came under the all-seeing eye of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which had cast its gigantic fine-meshed net over the whole of China. When she had calmed down a little, we went over all the ways of procuring an abortion that we could think of. We discussed the subject again and again behind her father's back, raking our brains for some solution that would be discreet enough to save the couple from disgrace in the eyes of the people, as well as from the political and administrative punishment. The law seemed to have been expressly designed to make things impossible for them. They couldn't go ahead and have the child before marrying, and the law prohibited abortion. At this moment of emotional upheaval, I could not help admiring my friend Luo's foresight in appointing me as her guardian. Since my mission included protecting her from bodily harm, I summoned every means of persuasion to stop her from running to the sorceress for a herbal remedy, for she risked not only being poisoned but also denounced. I was also able to convince her that jumping off the roof of her house in the hope of provoking a miscarriage was a very bad idea, for she might end up a cripple, in which case she would be condemned to marry the other cripple in her village. Eventually, we decided that I should go on a reconnaissance trip to the town of Yongjing, where I would sound out the hospital for ways of getting help from the gynecology department. Although Yongjing was the district capital, it was so small, as you no doubt remember, that whenever the canteen served beef and onions, you could smell it all over town. The modest hospital stood on a hillside past the high school basketball court, which did service as an open-air cinema. It consisted of two buildings. The first, reserved for outpatients, was the foot of the hill, and over the entrance it boasted an enormous portrait of uniformed Chairman Mao, waving his hand towards a multitude of waiting patients with whimpering children in tow. Further up on the hill stood a 3-story building in whitewashed brick, without balconies. It was there that the inpatients were housed. And so, after 2 days of tromping across the mountain and one sleepless night in a lice-ridden inn, I slipped into the clinic where the specialist staff had their consulting rooms. The better to blend in with the peasant folks, I was wearing my old sheepskin coat. However, as soon as I set foot in the medical atmosphere that had been so familiar to me since childhood, I became very apprehensive and broke out in a sweat. On the ground floor, at the end of a narrow, dimly lit corridor where the air was tainted with a stale underground smell, I came upon a waiting area with long benches against the walls, each occupied by a row of women. Most of them had swollen bellies. Some were giving little groans of discomfort. My eye was caught by a wooden sign with the word gynecology painted on it in red, over a formidably closed door. A few minutes later, the door opened a little way to let out an extraordinarily thin woman clutching a prescription. When the next patient stepped into the consulting room, I had just enough time to catch a glimpse of a white-coated figure seated behind a desk before the door closed again. I was very anxious to get another look at the gynecologist to see what sort of man he was. There was nothing for it but to sit and wait for the next time the door opened. Casting my eye over the women waiting on the benches, I was taken aback at the look of disapproval on their faces. There was no doubt that they were very annoyed. What they resented, I was quick to realize, was that I was so young, and male to boot. I should have disguised myself as a woman, I thought. I should have stuffed a cushion under my clothes to pretend I was pregnant. The last thing the women in the corridor wanted was to have a teenager in a sheepskin coat in their midst. They sat there looking daggers at me as if I were a pervert or peeping Tom. What a long wait it was. The door remained firmly shut for what seemed an interminable length of time. It was very hot. My shirt was drenched with sweat. I was worried that the moisture would make the writing on the inside of my sheepskin coat run, so I decided to take it off. This prompted the women to exchange agitated whispers. In the half-light of this dank, gloomy corridor, they resembled a pack of obese conspirators plotting ways to get rid of me. "What are you doing here?" snarled one of the women, tapping me on the shoulder. I turned to look at her. She had short hair and was dressed in trousers and a man's jacket. On her head she wore a green army cap with a red badge showing Mao's head in gold, a clear sign of her outstanding morals. Although she was heavy with child, her face was covered in pimples in various stages of eruption or healing. I pitied the child growing in her belly. I decided to play for time by pretending not to understand. I stared at her stupidly until she was obliged to repeat the question, and then, in slow motion, I cupped my left hand behind my ear in the gesture of a deaf mute. "Look, his ear's all bruised and swollen," said one of the waiting women. "This is the wrong place for ear diseases," shouted the woman with the cap, as though convinced of my deafness. "Ophthalmology is upstairs." A heated discussion ensued. And while the women argued about whether I needed an ophthalmologist or an otologist, the door opened. This was the long-awaited opportunity to make a mental note of the gynecologist's appearance. 40-ish, grizzled lanky hair, sharp features, tired-looking, a cigarette dangling from his lips. After his preliminary reconnaissance, I went for a long walk. Or rather, I strolled up and down the town's single high street. I lost track of how often I walked the distance from the hospital, past the basketball court, to the end of the street and back again. I kept thinking about the doctor. He seemed younger than my father. I could only hope that they had met. I had been told that he was on duty at the gynecology department on Mondays and Thursdays and devoted the rest of the week to surgery, urology, and digestive disorders. It was not likely that he knew my father, or at any rate had heard of him, as he had been quite famous in the province in the days before he was labeled a class enemy. I tried to picture my father or my mother in the gynecologist's shoes, finding the little seamstress and their beloved son in the consulting room of the district hospital. They'd be devastated. It would be the worst thing that could happen to them, worse than the Cultural Revolution. They'd throw us out at once without giving me a chance to explain that I was not the father. They would refuse to see me ever again. It was insane. But the Burgess intellectuals upon whom the communists had inflicted so much hardship were no less strict morally than their persecutors. That afternoon I went to the restaurant for a meal. Not that I was eager to do so, because the expense was a strain on my tight budget, but it was the only place where you could have an informal chat with strangers. You never knew, I thought. Perhaps I'd bump into some shady individual with inside information about procuring abortions. I ordered a roast chicken with fresh peppers and a bowl of rice. I lingered over my meal. It took me longer than a toothless man to finish, for as the amount of food on my plate dwindled, so my confidence ebbed away. Why would any disreputable character risk attracting attention by visiting the restaurant anyway? For 2 whole days, I made no further progress with my gynecological research. The only person with whom I was able to broach the subject was the night watchman of the hospital, a 30-year-old former policeman who had been dismissed from the post the year before for sleeping with 2 girls. I stayed with him in his cubicle until midnight, playing chess and exchanging tall stories. He asked me to introduce him to the pretty girls undergoing re-education on the mountain, of whom I claimed to be a connoisseur, but he flatly refused to listen to anything I had to say about my girlfriend having period problems. I don't want to know, he said, clearly alarmed. The hospital management heard of me getting mixed up in that kind of thing, they'd accuse me of being a recidivist and send me straight to prison. Towards noon on the 3rd day, having lost all hope of gaining access to the gynecologist, I prepared myself for the return journey up the mountain. Then, quite suddenly, I remembered the old man who used to be a preacher. I didn't know his name, but remembered seeing him in the audience at the film shows Luo and I attended, with his long silvery hair floating in the breeze. We had liked the look of him. There was an air of nobility about him, even when he was in his blue worker's uniform sweeping the street with a remarkably long-handled broom, even when he was mocked and spat upon by the townfolk, including 5-year-old urchins. For the past 20 years, he'd been forbidden to practice his faith. Every time I think of the old preacher, I'm reminded of the story about how his house was ransacked by the Red Guards. Under his pillow, they found a book written in a foreign language that no one could identify. Their reaction was not unlike that of a cripple and his gang when confronted with my copy of Cousin Pons. They had to send their booty all the way to the University of Beijing for identification, and it turned out to be a Latin Bible. After his exposure as a member of the Christian faith, the unfortunate fellow was forced to spend the rest of his days sweeping Yongjing's high street from morning to night, rain or shine. By the time Luo and I met him, he had become a permanent fixture in the town. To consult a preacher on the delicate subject of abortion seemed pretty outrageous. Was this business with the little seamstress making me lose all sense of proportion, I wondered. Then it occurred to me that I hadn't seen the grizzled street sweeper wielding his long-handled broom with mechanical regularity since I arrived in town 3 days before. I asked a cigarette vendor whether the old man had served out his term of forced labor. "Nah," he said. "He's at death's door, poor soul." "What's the matter with him?" "Cancer. His 2 sons have come from the city to visit him. They've taken him to hospital." Hearing this, I turned and broke into a run, although I hardly knew why. I raced up the high street to the other end of town as fast as my legs would carry me. By the time I reached the inpatient department, I was completely out of breath, but I knew what I had to do. I would approach the dying preacher sweeper in a last-ditch appeal for advice. Once inside the hospital, I was overcome by the confluent smells of disinfectant, overflowing latrines and greasy cooking. The place was like a wartime refugee camp, with the hospital wards doubling as kitchens. There were pans, chopping blocks, kettles, vegetables, eggs, salt cellars, bottles of soy sauce and vinegar scattered everywhere. Between the patients' beds and among the basins and the metal stands from which the blood transfusion bottles were suspended. At this midday hour, most of the patients seemed either to be hunched over some steaming pan, plunging their chopsticks into broth and squabbling over the noodles, or busy making omelets, which hissed and sputtered in frying pans full of boiling fat. The chaos and the noise shocked me. I had no idea that district hospitals were not equipped with proper kitchens and that patients had to see their own nourishment regardless of how serious their illness was, indeed regardless of whether they were disabled or even amputees. Covered in red, black, or green plasters, with their bandages coming undone and fluttering in the steam rising from the cooking pots, the invalid cooks made a clownish impression. I found the dying preacher in a ward with 6 beds. He was on a saline drip. Gathered around him were his 2 sons and his daughters-in-law, all of them aged about 40. A tearful old woman was preparing food on a small paraffin stove at the foot of his bed. I crouched down beside her. "Are you his wife?" I asked. She nodded. Her hands were shaking so badly that I offered to take the eggs and break them over the pan for her. Both sons wore blue Mao jackets, buttoned up to the neck. They had the demeanor of undertakers' assistants or government officials, yet they reminded me of a pair of news hounds in their strenuous efforts to get an old rickety tape recorder to work. The machine was rusty, it rattled and creaked, and the yellow enamel was flaked. There was a sudden ear-splitting whine as the recorder came to life, which so alarmed the other patients in the ward that they dropped their bowls, spilling the contents all over their bedclothes. The younger of the 2 sons motioned the occupants of the ward to silence, while his brother held a microphone to the preacher's lips. "Say something, Dad. Please," the elder son begged. The old man's silvery hair had almost fallen out, and his face had changed beyond recognition. He was a shadow of his former self, with jutting bones and skin like the thinnest sheet of rice paper, yellowed and dull. His body, once robust, had shrunk to half its size. Too weak to move under the tight bedclothes and clearly in pain, he raised his heavy eyelids. This sign of life was noted with surprise and joy by his entourage. The microphone was held to his lips once more, and the recorder started turning with a crunching sound like boots treading on broken glass. "Dad, please make an effort," the preacher's son pleaded. "We want to record your voice for the last time, so that your grandchildren will have something to remember you by. If you could just repeat one of Chairman Mound's sayings, that would be perfect. Just a few words or a slogan. Come on, try. They'll know their grandfather wasn't a reactionary after all, that he'd put all that behind him." A slight tremor passed through the preacher's lips as he shaped some words, but there was virtually no sound. For the next minute, he struggled on without anyone catching the gist of his whisperings. Even the old woman had to admit that she could not make a head or tail of what he was saying. Then he lapsed into a coma. The son rewound the tape, after which the whole family listened again to the mysterious message. "It's Latin," the elder son declared. He said the final prayer in Latin. Just like him, said the old woman, taking out a handkerchief to mop the perspiration on the preacher's forehead. At that instant, I jumped to my feet and made for the door without a word of explanation. By chance, I had caught a glimpse of the white-coated gynecologist standing ghost-like in the doorway, as if in slow motion. I had seen him take a last drag on a cigarette, exhale the smoke, flick the butt away, and vanish. In my rush to cross the room, I knocked over a bottle of soy sauce and tripped over an empty saucepan someone had left on the floor, which slowed me down. By the time I reached the door, there was no sign of the doctor. I hurried down the corridor in the hope of catching up with him, glancing into each doorway and asking everyone who crossed my path if they knew where he was. In the end, a patient pointed his finger to a door all the way at the end. I saw him go in there, into the emergency ward. Seems there's been an accident at the Red Flag factory. Someone's hand got caught in a machine, and all 5 of his fingers were cut off. When I was in front of the door, which was shut, I could hear the injured man groaning. I gave the door a little push, and it gave way at once, without any noise. Bandages were being applied to the patient, who was sitting up on the hospital bed, naked to the waist, stiff-necked, his head thrown back against the wall. He was about 30 years old, with a tanned, muscular torso and powerful shoulders. I slipped into the room and shut the door behind me. His mutilated hand was dressed with the first layer of gauze. The blood seeped through the white dressing, making stains that spread and dripped into a metal basin on the floor next to the bed, tick-tocking like a broken clock amid the poor man's cries of pain. The doctor had the same drained look of an insomniac as the first time I spotted him in the consulting room, but he seemed less indifferent now, less remote. He went on unwinding a large roll of gauze and wrapping it round and round the man's hand, without paying attention to me. He was certainly too engrossed in his work to notice my sheepskin coat. I felt in my pocket for a cigarette, which I lit. Then I stepped up to the bed, and with an almost dulcetory air, I placed the cigarette in the doctor's mouth, or rather, between his lips, by way of an offering on behalf of the little seamstress. Wordlessly, he shot me a quick glance and proceeded to smoke while he occupied himself with the bandages. I lit another cigarette, which I offered to the patient. He took it with the fingers of his right hand. Would you help me with this? The doctor said, passing me one end of the strip of gauze. Hold it tight. From either side of the bed, we pulled the bandage taut, like 2 men tying a parcel of string. The flow of blood was staunched, and as the patient's groans subsided, the cigarette slipped from his fingers. He promptly fell asleep. The effect of the anesthetic, the doctor explained. Who are you, anyway? He asked, securing the bandage with a final knot. I'm the son of one of the doctors at the provincial hospital, I told him. Actually, he doesn't work there anymore. What's his name? It had been my intention to give the name of Luo's father, but my own father's name came out of my mouth, and uncomfortable silence ensued. I had the impression that he had not only heard of my father, but also knew about his political troubles. What is it you want? He asked. It's my sister. She's been having problems with her periods for close on 3 months now. Impossible, he said coldly. Pardon? Your father has no daughters. You're a liar. Get out of my sight. He didn't raise his voice as he said this, nor did he send me away with a dismissive gesture. But I could tell he was very angry. He almost flung his cigarette butt in my face. Blushing with mortification, I headed for the door, but after a few steps, I turned to face him and heard myself saying, I have a proposition to make. If you can help my girlfriend, she'll be grateful to you for the rest of her life. And I'll give you a book by Balzac. It was a shock to hear the French author's name being spoken aloud in this clinical environment, this district hospital in the middle of nowhere. The doctor hesitated briefly, then opened his mouth to speak. I've already said you're a liar. How could you have got a hold of a book by Balzac? Without replying, I took off my sheepskin jacket, turned it inside out, and showed him the writing on the leather. The ink had faded somewhat, but my script was still legible. He cast an expert eye over the text, then drew out a packet of cigarettes, offered me one, and lit another for himself, which he smoked as he set about reading in earnest. The translation is obviously by Foulet, he murmured. I can tell from the style. You suffered the same fate as your father, poor man. Been labeled a class enemy. His remark brought tears to my eyes. I tried desperately not to cry, but could not help myself. And there I was, sniveling like a kid. It was not the little seamstress's predicament that was making me weep, I think, nor was it relief at having come this far in my efforts to save her. I was hearing the name of Foulet, Balzac's translator, someone I had never even met. It's hard to imagine a more moving tribute to the gift bestowed by an intellectual on mankind. This flood of emotion surprised me greatly at the time, and even today I remember it almost more clearly than the events that resulted from my encounter with a doctor. The following Thursday, it was the resourceful physician and lover of literature who set the date. The little seamstress, disguised as a 30-year-old woman with a white band round her forehead, presented herself at the operating theater. As the perpetrator of the pregnancy had not yet returned from the city, it was I who sat and waited in the corridor for 3 hours, straining my ears to hear what was going on behind the closed door. Distant, muffled sounds, water gushing from a tap, the heart-piercing cry of a woman, soft, unintelligible exchanges between nurses, hurried footsteps. The medical intervention was a success. When I was called at last, I was taken to a ward reeking of carbolic, where I found the gynecologist waiting for me. Meanwhile, the little seamstress was perched on a hospital bed at the far end, putting her clothes on with the help of a nurse. It was a girl, if you're interested, the doctor whispered. He struck a match and lit a cigarette. The deal we made was that I would give him our copy of Ursule Muruwe. But upon reflection, I decided to extend his reward to include the book I treasured most of all, Jean Christophe, which had been translated by the same Foulet. Although she still felt groggy from her ordeal, the little seamstress's relief was evident. Indeed, it could not have been greater if she had been facing life imprisonment and had just been found not guilty. She insisted that there was no need for her to rest at the inn before we set out for home. Instead, she wanted us to visit the cemetery where the old preacher had been buried 2 days earlier. She said it was not only thanks to him that I had gone back to the hospital, but that he had also, in some mysterious way, arranged my encounter with the gynecologist. We spent what little money we had left on a kilo of tangerines to place as an offering on the preacher's grave, which was marked with an inconspicuous slab of cement. We were sorry we didn't know any Latin, and that we were unable to deliver a funerary oration in the language he had employed on his deathbed, either to recite a prayer to his God or to extricate his life as a street sweeper. It was impossible to say which. For a while we debated whether we should take a solemn oath to learn Latin so that we might return one day to address him in that language, and at long last we decided against it. For where would we ever find a Latin primer? The only place we could think of was Four Eyes' parental home. Besides, we would never find anyone to teach us, as we had never heard of there being any other Chinese in these parts who knew Latin. The inscription on his gravestone was very plain. His name and 2 dates, that was all. The only indication of the religious office he had once held was a cross in vulgar red paint, as if he had been a pharmacist or a doctor. We did make one vow, though, that one day, in an imagined future when religions would no longer be prohibited and we ourselves would have plenty of money. We'd come back to erect a handsome, colorful monument to his memory, complete with a carved portrait of a man with silver hair and a crown of thorns, like the one Jesus wore. But he wouldn't have nails in the palms of his hands. He'd be holding a long-handled broom. After this, the little seamstress said she wanted to visit the old Buddhist temple to throw a few notes over the fence, in gratitude for the mercy shown by the heavenly powers. But the building was boarded up and locked, and we had already spent the last of our money.